If we're going to look into the origins of COVID and fully understand where this virus came from, this virus that has murdered so many people all over the world, I think the most important thing we can do today is look at the timeline. And if we go back to early 2020, when this was just starting to kill so many people, we'll see something interesting. That while Dr. Fauci, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Collins, Peter Daszak from EcoHealth, who, by the way, had a grant for gain-of-function research, Dr. Auchincloss and others were doing everything possible to shut down the Wuhan lab theory publicly, even though privately they told each other that COVID-19 looked engineered, and discussed the reason to stop the theory. And if they were to, it's really interesting. They wanted to give reasons for not expressing this opinion to the public were that it would do great potential harm to science and international harmony, and do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular, even though their paychecks are funded by the American taxpayers. At the same time this was going on, the CCP was using its full weight and power to spread a propaganda campaign to conceal the origins of COVID, numbers of cases and deaths, and protect their own reputations while stockpiling medical supplies, severely hurting the global supply chain and definitely hurting America. In the same way, the CCP silent, censored, and imprisoned dissenters who tried to tell the truth. Dr. Fauci and his cohorts seemingly were running their own misinformation and ultimately censorship campaign to, in quotes from Dr. Collins to Dr. Fauci, put down this very destructive conspiracy about the lab leak theory. But it's really interesting. I think we should revisit January 27th, 2020. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, finds out that they have a financial relationship with the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth Alliance, and that they've been working with novel coronaviruses. January 31st, 2020, Dr. Fauci is warned by Dr. Christian Anderson that some of COVID-19's features potentially look engineered, and the genome is inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Dr. Redfield, did you agree, in your opinion, with Dr. Anderson's assessment at the time that this virus did look engineered?
I was concerned because of the presence of the furin cleavage site that we've talked about. And I think it's important to understand what that cleavage site does. That cleavage site totally changes the orientation of the binding domain of COVID. So it now, which could not see the ACE2 receptor, which is the human receptor, it totally changes the orientation now, so it has high affinity for a human receptor. So that furin cleavage site bothered me. It didn't seem that it belonged there. And then when you look at the sequences that it used, and it's beyond the committee, but I know many of you have looked into it, the sequences that they used in those 12 nucleotides for arginine were the arginine sequences, nucleotide triplet, that coded for the human arginine. So why did this virus have the arginine sequences for human there, not bat? It was very disconcerting to me. It looked like this virus was engineered.
Was this, what you're observing and speaking of, is this something that would be in line with gain-of-function research and the capabilities it would provide to a virus?
Yeah, I mean, basically this lab published in 2014 that they accomplished in this, allowing the coronaviruses that they were working with in the lab to bind to the ACE2 receptor in humanized mice. And the only way they did that was by reorienting the binding domain.
And it was clear to them at this time that that was likely the issue in their private conversations. Yet by February 4th, a paper on the origins of COVID is drafted by 4 participants of the February 1 conference call. One of those participants, Dr. Anderson, completely reverses himself in an email to the president of EcoHealth, Peter Daszak, and says the main crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered and that is demonstrably false. My question to you, Mr. Redfield, did you know of any evidence that they had found within 3 days from February 1st to February 4th to be able to confirm that it was not created in a lab?
As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, I was excluded from those conversations, which I found retroactively very disappointed, since I was obviously a virologist and very engaged, and I actually had asked Jeremy Farrar, Tony Fauci, and Tedros to have these conversations. And then to be excluded, I found unusual. I do think it illustrates one point that's worth really focusing on. When you have a group of people that decide there can only be one point of view, that's problematic. And I'll keep going saying it's antithetical to science, and unfortunately that's what they did.
I can tell you, Dr. Redfield, that is the case. It's very problematic because how people suffered in this country from those, what I would call tyrannical decisions, using their positions of power and shutting down the country in the way they did. I think people definitely do feel that way. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I want